5 years later, January 6th is no longer just a date. It is a mirror. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And when I look at America today, I don't see a nation arguing over opinions. I see a nation divided over reality itself. The same day that lawmakers gathered to re-examine evidence of an attack on democracy, some of the very people once convicted for that violence returned to the Capitol, calling themselves patriots. One side says history must be remembered. The other says history has been lied about. And both claim to be defending the truth. This is not simply about the past. It is about who gets to define it. Because when facts no longer settle arguments, power does. And when power rewrites memory, democracy quietly weakens. If this matters to you, if understanding how democracies erode from within matters, stay with me. Share this conversation. Listen closely. Because before we can talk about accountability, we must first understand the fracture itself. And that's where we go next. To understand why January 6th still divides America so deeply, we have to be precise about what is actually being contested. The disagreement is not over images. The footage exists. Police officers beaten, lawmakers fleeing, the Capitol breached. The disagreement is over meaning. For many Democrats, January 6th represents a direct assault on democratic transfer of power, encouraged by a sitting president who continues to insist the election was stolen. For Trump and much of the Republican Party, the day has been reframed, downplayed, recast, or dismissed as political theater, media obsession, or even a national injustice against his supporters. This is how parallel political realities form. The same event, processed through entirely different moral frameworks. One side sees accountability as essential to democracy. The other sees accountability as persecution. One commemorates fallen officers. The other honors a rioter as a martyr. And once politics becomes a battle between narratives rather than facts, institutions begin to bend under the strain. To see how America arrived at this moment, we need to step back into the forces that shaped this fracture long before January 6th itself. To understand January 6th, we have to understand the long road that led there. This was not a spontaneous eruption. It was the product of a cycle, political, psychological, and institutional. For years, distrust in elections had been cultivated, amplified by social media, reinforced by partisan media ecosystems, and validated by powerful voices. When the 2020 election ended, millions were already primed to believe defeat could only mean fraud. Then came repetition. The same claim, stated again and again. The election was stolen, not proven, not litigated successfully, but repeated until it felt true to those who wanted it to be. History shows us this pattern. When institutions lose legitimacy in the eyes of a segment of the public, alternative loyalties emerge. People stop trusting courts, legislatures, even law enforcement unless those institutions serve their side. By January 6th, belief had hardened into identity. The Capitol was no longer a building, it was a symbol. And symbols once charged are powerful enough to mobilize crowds. That brings us to the moment when belief turned into action and America crossed a line. Then came the first rupture. January 6th was supposed to be procedural, a certification, a formality. Instead, it became a crisis, broadcast live to the world. Crowds pushed past barricades, windows shattered. Police officers were assaulted, lawmakers hid, evacuated, ran. Inside the Capitol, democracy was physically interrupted. Outside, something else was happening. The event was instantly splitting into two meanings. For many Americans, this was an insurrection, an attack on the constitutional order. For others, it was framed as chaos provoked by outsiders, exaggerated by the media, or even justified by grievance. That split mattered more than the violence itself, because within days, accountability stalled. Political backlash softened, corporate condemnation faded, and crucially, enough lawmakers chose silence or deflection over consequence. If you care about how democracies fail, This is the moment to watch closely. Crises don't end systems. What follows them does. Because when a society cannot agree on what just happened, the next crisis is already being prepared. And that leads us to the mechanisms that quietly rewrote January 6 after the smoke cleared. What followed January 6 was not chaos. It was something far more deliberate. Power moved from the streets to the story. The mechanism was simple and devastatingly effective. First, redefine accountability as persecution. Investigations were no longer about facts, but about partisan revenge. Prosecutors became villains. Courts became political actors. Truth became just another opinion. Then came reward. Years later, nearly everyone charged in connection with the attack was pardoned. Violent offenders walked free. Pending cases were erased. Prosecutors were pushed out. Evidence was scrubbed. History itself was edited. This is how systems protect themselves when they refuse to confront wrongdoing. Not by denying events outright, but by exhausting the public, muddying the narrative, and reframing victims as aggressors. January 6th was no longer an attack on democracy. It became, in official language, a grave national injustice committed against those who carried it out. Once that inversion takes hold, institutions don't collapse. They hollow out. And when justice is undone this way, the damage doesn't stop at memory. It spreads into behavior, into belief, into the next wave of consequences. That wave is coming next. The second crisis didn't explode in a single afternoon. It unfolded quietly over time. After the pardons came something more unsettling: repetition. Some of those once convicted went on to commit new crimes. Others embraced January 6 not as a mistake, but as an identity. A community formed hardened, unrepentant, bound by grievance and validation from power. What had been a legal reckoning became a cultural signal. Lawless action, taken in service of political loyalty, would be tolerated, even celebrated, and institutions adjusted accordingly. Investigations ended abruptly, prosecutors were reassigned or resigned, mentions of January 6 vanished from records. Accountability mechanisms that once seemed immovable simply stopped. This is a different kind of crisis. Not a riot, but normalization. Not violence on camera, but erosion behind closed doors. Because when consequences disappear, behavior changes. The lesson absorbed is not caution, it's permission. And permission, once granted from the top, reshapes the ground beneath a society. To understand what that feels like, not in theory, but in daily life, we need to shift our focus away from institutions and toward the people living inside their failure. That's where we go next. Now, let me bring this closer to you, because while elites argue over narratives, you live with the consequences. If you're a police officer who defended the Capitol, you watched your sacrifice slowly erased. No plaque, no official remembrance, just silence. If you're a family member of an officer injured or one who later died, you saw the country move on, while the people who attacked them were called victims. If you're an ordinary citizen, you learned a dangerous lesson, that the rules are not the same for everyone, that loyalty can matter more than law, that truth can lose to repetition. And even if you weren't there, even if politics exhausts you, this reaches into your life. Because when elections are questioned without evidence, when courts are dismissed, when violence is rebranded as patriotism, the ground beneath democracy weakens for everyone. If this makes you uneasy, it should. Pause. Share this. Talk about it. Because democracies don't collapse only from coups. They collapse when ordinary people are taught to stop caring. And what's happening here doesn't stay contained within one country. It never does. What happens inside the United States rarely stays inside the United States. January 6 sent a signal far beyond Washington. Allies watched closely, adversaries watched even more carefully, not just to see whether an insurrection could happen, but whether it would matter. When accountability stalled, when power returned to those who denied the violence, the message was unmistakable. Democratic norms are negotiable. Elections can be questioned without proof. Violence can be reframed. Institutions can be pressured until they bend. For autocratic leaders around the world, this was not a warning, it was a lesson. If the world's oldest constitutional democracy could absorb an attack on its own legislature and then pardon those responsible, why should others fear consequences? The moral authority of democratic governance weakened, not with a bang, but with a shrug. This is how global norms erode. Not through invasion, but imitation. Not through speeches, but precedents. And as trust fractures at home, influence diminishes abroad. Democracy becomes harder to defend when its defenders cannot agree on what threatens it. So the question now is not just what January 6 was, it's what kind of future grows from it. That's the choice we face next. When we look ahead, there are only a few paths this story can take. The first is the optimistic one. History reasserts itself. Evidence endures. Over time, even deeply divided societies can recalibrate. January 6 becomes a cautionary tale, a moment when democratic backsliding went too far and institutions slowly, imperfectly corrected course. Accountability may be delayed, but truth survives long enough to matter. The second path is more likely. Memory fragments. January 6 hardens into a partisan symbol rather than a shared lesson. Each side teaches its own version. Democracy continues to function, but thinner, more brittle. Elections happen, institutions stand. Yet trust never fully returns, and every transfer of power carries suspicion. Then there is the darkest path. The inversion becomes permanent. Political violence is normalized if it serves the right cause. Pardons become precedent. Institutions exist, but no longer constrain power. Democracy remains in name, hollow in practice. History teaches us something uncomfortable. Systems don't choose their future. People do, often passively, often too late. Which path America follows will depend less on courts or committees and more on whether society insists on shared reality. And that brings us to the final, unavoidable question. What will you do with this moment? 5 years after January 6, the question is no longer what happened. The footage exists, the testimonies exist, the records exist. History is not missing. What's missing is consensus and the courage that consensus requires. I've covered democracies around the world long enough to recognize this moment. Not the collapse, the pause before it. The space where a society decides whether truth is worth defending when it's inconvenient. You don't need to storm a building to damage democracy. You only need to look away, to accept distortion, to grow numb. If you care about free elections, accountable power, and shared reality, this is not someone else's fight. It's yours. Talk about it. Challenge lies. Demand memory. Because democracy doesn't fail all at once. It fades when enough people stop insisting on it. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it. Stay engaged. Watch what happens next. Because January 6 was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a test. And that test is still underway.